Hello, good evening. Thank you all for being with us tonight in CCA's living room. I'm Amara Nash, the Associate Director of Operations. And during this season of culinary delights, we are excited to host this conversation on food, and specifically women's role in the foodscape, both historically and today. From that initial transition from gathering food to planting food to saving seeds and passing them on to incorporating ingredients, both indigenous and introduced, all the way to present day food systems and culinary artistry, women have played a significant, though sometimes unacknowledged, role in feeding us all. But before I introduce our guests, I want to share our appreciation for your support. We have been able to keep most of our programming free during this time because of your generosity. So I'm putting up a link now. In the event that you are inspired and able to support us in this living room series, you can click on that and it'll open in another tab that you can address later. But anyway, thank you all for your ongoing support in all the ways. If you'd like to learn more about our upcoming Living Room Series programming, including Sunday's event, America and the Antidote, a conversation on kindness and compassion, you can visit our website, ccasantafe.org, and look for the Living Room Series. You can also see archived recordings of previous programs there also. For tonight's event, you will have the most successful viewing experience if you don't have any other streaming happening in your house simultaneously. Our platform's a little touchy about internet bandwidth. However, we are recording, so if there are any hiccups, you can revisit those spots after the fact. You can and are, in fact, encouraged to ask questions during tonight's event in the chat bar, and we'll try to address as many of those as we can. So let's get started. We are so lucky to have with us tonight two amazing women doing important food-related work in our communities. One is Gina Ray LaCerva. When I first read her book, Feasting Wild, I knew I wanted to hear more from her and work with her in some way. So hopefully this is just a beginning. I'm going to put up an offer that links to her book on Collected Works website. Wherever you are, we encourage you to support your local bookstore. This just happens to be the link that I chose for tonight's event. Gina Ray is an award-winning writer, geographer, environmental anthropologist, originally from Santa Fe. And this is her first book, Feasting Wild, In Search of the Last Untamed Food. It was recommended by the New York Times and named an Amazon Best Book of the Year in 2020. Her essays have appeared in Emergence Magazine, The Magazine, Sage Magazine, and more. Our other guest, Andy Murphy, an amazing woman, Navajo woman, doing work on the food scene, hosts the Toasted Sister podcast about Indigenous food. It's a wealth of interesting and important information gathered from Indigenous people across the country. And I think I first heard about Andy and her podcast in Edible Magazine, another important female-run culinary effort. So shout out to Stephanie. Andy's also a producer with the Native American Calling radio program, a 1-hour national radio show about Indigenous issues and topics. Oh, and I'm actually going to put up a link now. All of these you can open and visit after the fact, but this is a link to her podcast page where you can see previous and upcoming, or listen to previous and upcoming podcasts. She's also a freelance food writer and a photographer. She actually led a great food photography workshop as part of this programming series, which you can see on Instagram, CCA's Instagram page. You might have noticed that I said we're joined by two women, and you were probably expecting three. So were we, but I'm sorry to report that Paula Garcia from the Acequia Association was unable to join the conversation tonight. So we won't have her perspective, but we're going to have a wonderful conversation with these wonderful women. And I'm going to turn it over to them. I might pop in on occasion if I have a question, but I'll let you two take it away.
All right. Hello, everybody. Out there in the ether. So yes, as Amara said, we were going to have a bit of a panel and I was going to do some moderating, but we're adapting to the circumstances. So Andy and I are just going to have a conversation about food and feminism and women and eating and all those fun things. And we really encourage the audience to join in the conversation. So if questions pop up during the conversation, jump on that chat, and hopefully it can be like we're all together in a room, which we all miss right now. So we're doing the best we can. So I guess to start out, Andy, I would love to hear a little bit about your background, how you got involved in the food scene, and about potentially your recent TV appearance, if you want to mention that.
Yeah. Let's see. My mic is on, right?
Yep.
Okay, cool. All right. Yeah, so, it's kind of an accident that I just, fell into this food scene here. I just fresh out of college, my first job was as like a features writer for the Las Cruces Sun News. And, one day the food writer for the entertainment magazine, they weren't able to do, a feature that week. So I got thrown in there. My editor told me, go to this French restaurant, order something, write about it, and take a picture while you're at it. And that turned into something that I was kind of good at. And then I became like the food writer for Las Cruces News for the Pulse, the entertainment magazine. And it was part of my job to go to restaurants every week, taste around, write about it, take pictures. And I did that for a good, 3 years or so. So in that time, I just got obsessed with food and finding out the stories behind a plate of food. I talked to restaurant owners, I talked to chefs, I researched about culture, about different issues that, people would tell me about when I'm talking to them about their food and their restaurant. Doing different research on flavors and spices and origins of all these things. So I just went all into it.
Is it the dream job we all imagine it to be?
Yeah, no, it's not like a 100% dream job. It's hard work. Trying not to use the word delicious or good while you're talking about food is kind of hard. But I've always been, a writer. I've always loved adding color and description to my writing. I think that's why, writing about food was pretty natural for me to do that. And so, I got a job here in Albuquerque as a producer for Native America Calling radio program, focusing on Native issues and topics. And I did my first show about Native food about 5.5 years ago. And that just really opened my eyes up to this whole wide world of Indigenous food. And, I kind of, started learning about this whole Indigenous food movement as, chefs and farmers and Native people were starting to get the work done to revitalize Native food. So that's kind of like the definition of the Native food movement, or the Native food sovereignty movement, is revitalizing Native food in a whole bunch of different ways. And then I started a podcast because all I want to talk about is food, of course, and noticed there wasn't a podcast out there about Native food. So I started that 4 years ago, and now 70 episodes in, I'm speaking to you guys about Native food, because I've gained so much knowledge after 4 years of, talking about Native food every day, thinking about Native food every day, researching about Native food every day. there's so much to learn, and I'm happy to share it with everybody, especially back here in Santa Fe.
Yeah, so I'm going to just out you and say you were recently on Taste the Nation with Padma Lakshmi, and you were talking a little bit about fry bread, right? Which is something that a lot of us think about when we think about Native food. Can you talk a little more about sort of the positives and the negatives of that association?
Yeah, when I was invited to take part in that filming, I said yes right away, because I always wanted to do that for Anthony Bourdain. I wanted to be his Indian guide, to lay out the landscape and then take him to a restaurant or two. But I never got the chance to do that. So Padma, she came around and asked me, and I said yes. And then later, the producers gave me an idea of what the filming was going to look like. And they said, we're going to have you sit down with Padma at a fry bread truck. And I'm like, ugh. And you're going to have, fry bread together. And I'm like, ugh. And, I say that I feel that way about fry bread, because I think a lot of us in this whole Native food movement, we are trying to change the identity of Native American food, of Indigenous food. Right now, the identity of Indigenous food is fry bread and Indian tacos. And, that's not something that we got to define ourselves. Fry bread comes from a very painful, awful history. It's a product of starvation. It's a product of imprisonment. Its origins is, somewhere here in New Mexico. After the long walk, Navajos were forced, 400 miles to Fort Sumner here in New Mexico, to a prison camp, and literally torn away from their food and food sources, and put into this prison camp where they had, rations like flour and salt and some kind of grease like lard or whatever. And somebody there helped them come up with this fried bread, which, it's kind of fascinating how this bread just kind of spread all over, because seems like every tribe here in the United States has their own kind of fry bread. So it has that painful history, but it also has that, it's something that shows, how our ancestors just wanted to survive and needed to survive and adapted. So it's celebrated as that as well, but it's not something that we picked for our, poster child, our Native food poster child. It's something that was forced on us. So we're all trying to change that. But for the filming in Phoenix, sitting down with Padma, talking about that, I got to talk about that a little bit. But then during the show, we did talk about trying to change the identity of Native American food, and that's all part of this whole food movement as well. So I personally make it a mission. I don't know if you could call it a mission, but I haven't learned how to make fry bread. Before I learned about Native food and food sovereignty and food identity, I didn't really pay attention to how my mom made it. She knows how to make it. My grandma knows how to make it. Everybody in my family knows how to make it. So whenever we had fry bread, I just had their fry bread and never bothered to learn how to make it. Now I'm like, I don't even want to know, because I jumped on that bandwagon. I don't want it to be a part of my food identity. And, for me, it stops right here, which I think is pretty good. It's exciting to try to guess what is going to become like the poster children of Indigenous food. But yeah, so fry bread.
Yeah, well, we were talking about how it's similar with matzah crackers. So shout out to all my Jews out there, and that a lot of food culture actually comes from these sort of histories of starvation and survival. and trauma. And so how do you kind of honor that and also move it forward, right?
Yeah. You know, with definitely fry bread is one of those things. In talking to Native chefs from different tribes, I've learned of something called burnt corn soup, and I think that has a sad story, but it's one of those that has both tears and celebration. The government, long time ago in the early 1800s, when there was a lot of conflicts with indigenous people, lots of wars with tribes, lots of, massacres and genocide. Part of that conflict was to wipe out the food system, to burn down whole crops and farms and kill all, the livestock, or just, mow down all of the buffalo. That's why there's hardly any buffalo, is because the government needed to control the Lakota, Dakota, Nakota in the Great Plains. And to do that, you wipe out their food source. So a lot of those kinds of scorched earth policies happened back then. And one of the tribes up in the northeast, they have this soup called burnt corn soup, literally from, picking what corn was still edible from, having their whole field, all their fields burned down. So there's that. But definitely contemporarily, I think a lot of chefs, and just like a lot of Native people, we cannot forget the past and where we come from, because it's still very, it still weighs very heavily on us, that generational trauma. So you can't separate that generational trauma and that painful history from food, because it's all part of culture. Food is part of culture, music is part of culture, art is part of culture, all of this, language and everything, ceremony, spirituality, that's all part of culture and being Native. So of course you're going to carry, some of that pain, some of that conflict with you, but, immediately right away, celebrate that we're still here. I know you hear a lot of Native people say that, we're still here. That's because a lot happened to get rid of us, and we are still here. And, part of just like eating Native foods and learning about Native food is, celebrating the fact that we're still here.
Right. And often, to bring it back to feminism, it was women who carried those traditions forward, right? Kind of almost in a hidden way. It was just sort of the daily act of cooking that brought that food and those cultural traditions forward. But it's fascinating the way that so much of that history has been lost. One of the earliest tools, most likely the earliest tool, was a woven satchel that humans used to bring gathered food home. But those actually degrade in the archaeological record. And so we know about stone tools, but we don't necessarily know as much about these woven tools. So, there's really fascinating research that shows that actually we should be called gatherer hunters in our history, because primarily calories came from gathering, which was primarily women's work. So, I think it's really interesting how we recover that lost history that literally doesn't exist in any sort of record. You were mentioning that a lot of Native history is based on oral histories or storytelling, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, it's very little, tribal people, indigenous people, had like written record of things. I know some Great Plains tribes, they have like winter counts where they kept track of one of the most important events of the year on a big buffalo hide, and kept track of, generations like that. There are some like, wall art and stuff like that, and definitely some stories to tell in like pottery and different art. But really, storytelling and history was kept through, storytelling, origin stories, and ceremony, because these things are the things that are very, very important, and they are passed down from generation to generation into, what it is now. And current history is written, by settlers and pioneers and white men, who most of the time didn't value the place of women, didn't value the work that we do in food, in raising next generations. So there's that part of, that, but in our Native communities, Native women have always been, matriarchs. We've always been the leaders of our tribe and the keepers of, of different ceremonies, of, recipes, even though there weren't recipe books, we passed these things down from generation to generation. And definitely seeds. I learned about, I think it was on the Long Walk, the Cherokee Trail of Tears. The Cherokee are not from Oklahoma. They got moved there from, the East Coast. And a bunch of tribes who live in Oklahoma, they got forced, to Oklahoma from the East Coast. And, on their way, they kind of had no idea where they were going, but they knew that they had to save some seeds. So there are stories about how women, sewed seeds into their clothing, or braided it into their hair. And I learned this recently with African American, African slaves who were brought over here. They braided seeds into their hair because they didn't know where they were going, but they knew if they got there, they had to feed themselves. So, there's that part of like history keeping.
Yeah, I think particularly with food, it's a difficult subject to create a written history about. I mean, we all have recipes now, but when you were talking, I was thinking about, I think every person can relate to, anyone who cooks based on their mother's or grandmother's recipes can relate to that feeling of calling up your mom and saying, I want to make your chicken. How do I do it? And she's like, oh, you just put a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And sometimes I do this, right? So because of how food exists, and that food culture, it is more amorphous. There's often this kind of more contextual way that knowledge is passed down. So you learn the instinct of it rather than the sort of specifics of it, which in some ways makes it really beautiful and I think resilient to the forces of, history and colonialism, as you're saying, because it is that it's woven, it's hidden, it's carried on our bodies. You learn to make soup by making soup over and over again.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
That's very interesting. You were talking about the woven bags. In Native communities, there's a lot of that interconnectedness too. Everything's kind of like woven together. It's an act of ceremony. It's an act of spirituality to weave these kinds of tools. What everybody sees is like a beautiful piece of art and a beautiful piece of basketry. It really has like this deep history, which I think a lot of non-Native people don't really understand, and it's all connected to food. And I know contemporarily we look at woven baskets as art, and they sell for like hundreds and thousands of dollars, but then you have things that go on like art auctions in faraway places, overseas. I've done so many shows about this issue for Native America Calling, and every time I have to do it, it's just like so infuriating because there's just this like, I don't care about your history. I don't care what you think now. It's mine. I bought it, but really you stole it. Your ancestors probably dug some graves and disrespected our ancestors so that you could have it. And now somehow it's yours and you're going to sell it out at the auction for thousands of dollars. That's just like the most, I hate talking about this topic. I feel strongly about it every time I have to, because there's this skewed like thing of ownership.
Right. Well, I think it's a good segue actually into a question we just got, which is a little bit about food appropriation. The question talks about the intellectual property rights in relationship to native food. So she specifically mentioned Zuni blue corn and ongoing work from Zuni farmers to deal with this issue. Is that something that you've researched or come across?
Yeah. I would like to get a little more into it and do like a whole episode about this, because it goes into that like ownership.
So yeah, I mean, I don't know a ton about this issue, but I imagine what this person's talking about is perhaps trying to patent certain seeds or corn that's been passed down for generations and stewarded by Native peoples.
It wasn't just like stewarded by Native people. It was cultivated and made by Native people. Corn comes from indigenous people in Central South America. And through our ancient, trade routes, it came up here where it's just like part of life and part of origin for Navajo, for Zuni, and tribes all, up to, into the plains and a little bit into Canada. But it does get into just illegal appropriation. I don't know. There are some like local, some small tribes in Mexico, South America area, where they are working with indigenous lawyers and indigenous entrepreneurs to patent their stuff. Because that's happening. Somebody will, some non-native person will, take some corn and, find out the genetics, change it a little bit, tweak it a little bit, and then call it their own and sell it and make millions of dollars, billions of dollars. And indigenous people don't get anything. And that's unfair, but I guess that's the way of business and science these days, is to call it your own, tweak it and call it your own. That's just, it also goes into like the erasure of indigenous science. I think a lot of people think that Native people, indigenous people here were just running around eating things off the ground and didn't have an intricate understanding of agriculture, an intricate understanding of the stars. But since we didn't write it down and it's passed through generations and the act of, doing agriculture, it's not like a real science, and we can just take it from you because indigenous people don't know what they're doing anyways. So we'll just take it. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it's difficult. It's difficult topics, right? Because food culture is always changing, and there always is some level of appropriation, I think, that happens naturally as people experiment. Same with crops. But I do think part of the issue is who gets paid, and if Monsanto can, copyright seeds, then why shouldn't an indigenous tribe that's developed that seed? Definitely complicated. Why don't you tell me a little bit about some of the women that you've highlighted that are doing really interesting food work contemporarily and pushing that culture forward?
Yeah, well, on the topic of seeds, Rowan White, she's with CR Seeds and also Native American Food Sovereignty Alliance. Every time she speaks about seeds, you can definitely feel the passion in her voice. You can see, the work she does to rematriate seeds, which means, and on that topic of like ownership, which means bringing seeds back from whatever museum or university, storage room or, catalog that it got put into, became
back to more of a living entity in a way.
Yeah, more of a living thing, because it's not doing anything. It's not doing any good if it's just sitting in a university bank somewhere. And meanwhile, the indigenous people where it comes from, they don't even have access to it. So part of her work is to bring those seeds back, grow them out, and then, you know, take them back to the tribe, which is a really, really cool thing to do. So she does a lot of that kind of work. You know, on like the business end. Blue Adams, she's Navajo. She owns a couple of different restaurants. You know, she does good work like all around. She not only just like starts restaurants all the time, but she is doing work during, you know, COVID times right now to you know, raise money for PPE for, you know, back home on Navajo Nation. I think she just recently partnered up with the James Beard Foundation to really like add her indigenous voice and experience and network to that, you know, very white nonprofit. And then there are, you know, folks like the women of the I Collective. The I Collective, they're really, really cool. They have a really powerful voice, and you know what they want is change, and what they want is access. So in the media you kind of see people like Britt Reed, Hillel Echohawk, and Christina Stanley. They are just really awesome, you know, female warriors who are out there showing food, showcasing food, but also like in the media talking about, you know, inequities that are still here today within our native food systems. Then you got like some academics like Elizabeth Hoover and Devin Mahitsuwa. They wrote a really good book I recommend to all of you guys if you want to learn more about this whole indigenous food movement. I think it's literally called Native American Food Sovereignty. And it came out, I think, last year. So all of the voices you hear, you see in that book, you know, they're doing work right now in Native communities to create access to revitalize indigenous food. And then, yeah, you've got, you know, kind of like, you know, everybody who's doing this kind of work here, they always make sure to add like that kind of spiritual connection to anything, to everything that they do. And I was on that episode of with Padma. I was on that episode with Felicia Kokoksu Ruiz, and she's just like the sweetest person ever. I love talking to her anytime I get the chance or anytime I need to. But she just has this really awesome way of like connecting anything she does in the kitchen with spirituality. And you know, she probably could have been a really good person to have on this panel as well, talking about women's roles in Native food and being the keepers of that kitchen spirituality. So she's a really awesome resource. And, you know, all the women that I have on my podcast, they are, you know, they're on my podcast for a reason, because they do awesome work across the board. Yeah, so I have a couple more names here. Let's see. Sorry. I just recently had Shyla Shepard and Missy Begay on. They're here at Bow and Arrow Brewing. They're really awesome in you know, just creating this force in the whole brewing environment. Yeah, every time I get to talk to them, it's so awesome that, you know, they have this goal and they have this vision, and they made it happen despite, you know, despite there being breweries like popping up at every corner right now.
They're the ones using some local plants and flavors. Is that part of their ethos?
Yeah. They just had one that had like juniper berry and sumac, and they had one, I think, a while ago that included Navajo tea and blue cornmeal. So it's really awesome how they're starting to add that to their whole, menu of beers.
Yeah,
but your book on wild food, where do you see women there, and how have their roles changed?
Yeah, so as I was saying, women basically feed the planet. We provide the majority of the calories on Earth to humans. And one of the things that I think is so fascinating about food is that it's both, as you said, this very spiritual thing. It connects us very deeply to ecologies, to the past, to our own bodies. And yet it's also this very mundane thing that just has to happen every day. You have to feed yourself. So I find that intersection really interesting, that it can be both at the same time, something very elevated and beautiful and something that's just the daily grind. But even today, a lot of wild food, people still subsist on wild food throughout the world, even though it's increasingly becoming a luxury. And women do a lot of that labor and we don't even know about it. So for instance, there's a lot of women that are involved in fishing in Mexico, and literally there aren't the studies or the statistics to understand what role they're doing, because they're often taking fish home from the fishermen and cleaning or doing things in the home. And so that home-based work is not valued in the same way in the kind of international economies and labor markets. So I think it's a challenge. It's like, how do we bring light to that, but also recognize that the ability to do things at home has meant that it's continued. I was just reading about Asma Khan, who's a chef. She was on Chef's Table, I think season 5 or 6, but she staffs her restaurant with all female chefs that kind of aren't professionally trained but grew up cooking. So home-based, home-taught female chefs. So I think that's some of the ways that I think we're starting to see this valuation of women's labor on a larger scale and starting to appreciate it. I think, unfortunately, the sort of legacies of colonialism, the very much industrial capitalist nature of our food system has made it harder to bring women's labor into the forefront and valued. But, I think part of what we can do is start just appreciating the women who cook for us in our lives, right? Like, it starts at home in many ways. But I'm curious how, in terms of the food sovereignty and food appropriation conversation, what do you see as sort of the way forward through that, given that food culture is always intermixing? When we think of like Chinese American food, that's not really Chinese food, but it's very much Chinese American food. And so how do we think of, indigenous food coming into the 21st century, especially when people are trying to eat locally? Maybe how do we, as New Mexicans, support the indigenous food movement here?
Yeah, that's a really hard one. But I'll start with that last question first. There are very few places that people can, like brick and mortar restaurants and kitchens like that in Native America, and that's just coming from this whole like skewed structure of wealth and economics. It's documented that people of color, especially women, don't have that kind of access to wealth that other people might have. And, it could be a whole other panel or a whole, 10 episodes just explaining in Native America, like the economics and why there aren't very many Native businesses out there. And it just goes back to Indian law and policy, these things that have been put in place by the government, that forms, individual sovereign tribes. And it's very hard to create, access to capital and get loans for businesses. And, that's kind of trickled outwards to generations like mine. I'm a homeowner, and I'm the first homeowner in my family. since the beginning of time. Yeah. So, when I started learning about all of this economic injustice and lack of access to wealth, I made up my mind, way in the back of my mind, in the back burner, way back here. I made up my mind. I'm like, I need a house. I need to get a house, because if I want to do anything, if I want to have a business, if I want to start a restaurant, I think having a house would make things so much better, so much easier, because that's how everybody else starts businesses. So now I have a house, and this is my house right here.
It's a really weird moment for brick and mortar restaurants in general. I mean, as we've seen with COVID, so many are not surviving, and there's been a lot of chat amongst chefs that the model, it wasn't sustainable before COVID, and COVID was sort of like the thing that just wiped out a lot of people. So I think it will be really interesting. I know San Francisco or California just passed that basically people can have home-based food dinner parties, made that more legal. So, I think we're gonna have to start getting creative, right? If we want to bring in people that haven't necessarily had access to capital or the resources.
Yeah, definitely. And it's happening in, different areas of Native communities. There's definitely lots of Native lawyers out there who are trying to get those laws changed. There's lots of people who are trying to advocate to get some of these food laws changed that are in Native communities that make Native food illegal in some places. Like in nursing homes, in schools, you cannot serve indigenous wild food. You cannot serve wild caught meat. You have to have that stamp from the government. It has to be approved, or else it's illegal. Or you can't sell it at a restaurant, but that's like my native food. I can't even sell it at a restaurant. So there's that happening. There's movements in agriculture to grow tribal agriculture, support small businesses. So I think, in the future, and definitely everybody has to support whatever Native businesses are out there right now, because there's not very many of them, and they definitely don't have like the presence others do. Santa Fe, it's all about art and jewelry, and sometimes it's about art and jewelry 1 or 2 days of the year, Santa Fe Indian Market, but there's not very much food there. And then I think, what was your other question about? Yeah,
I think it was just sort of like, we're also aware of appropriation right now, and we don't want to keep perpetuating this stuff. So how do we start, but also recognizing that food has been basically a culture of appropriation throughout time, right? Like, we appropriated pasta from China, the Italians, and then, brought that to America. And like, it's always been this thing that's tied into conquest and migration. So yeah, I think, I don't know, I'm just interested in that conversation of how we recognize that aspect to food, but then also make sure, and I think you answered it with, some of it has to do with capital and getting the resources to people that have historically been disenfranchised from the food world. So we're got about 10 minutes left. So I'm just curious if there's any other questions from the audience or any topics that you're all interested in hearing us speak to. There's plenty more we can talk about, but I just wanted to jump in there and see if anyone else had thoughts.
Yeah. Well, with appropriation, one answer would just be to stay in your lane. I don't know. I love cooking Middle Eastern food. Like, I love cooking Middle Eastern food, and I do it like very often in my own kitchen, more than I do indigenous food. But, because I know about theft and cultural appropriation, I will never, ever, open up a Middle Eastern restaurant, because that's not my place. And I think people just have to realize where their place is. when it comes to that, when it comes to cultural appropriation, because right now with social media, and we have these big voices that could reach all across the globe right now, we can rise up and take you down, and that's definitely what's happened to a couple of people who have non-native people, to white people who have built these big empires or banked on somebody else's culture, and they get the heat from the community where this culture comes from. So I don't know the perfect answer for that. I know that's I don't know, kind of rough to say, stay in your lane, but just staying in your lane, you could be so much more creative in your own lane if you put in a little bit of effort to learn about your own food and your own history and where your food and culture is. Then that makes it more authentic, whatever that word means these days.
Yeah.
But yeah, so
yeah, let's see what else. So you're also a food photographer. So, I think just to bring it back to CCA and art, the aesthetics of food are so important, right? So are there aspects to the aesthetics of Native food that might be different from, say, the aesthetics of Italian food? Or
yeah, well, every food stylist, every magazine feature, has well, it doesn't happen very much these days. I mean, I look at a lot of food magazines and cookbooks and stuff, but I'm trying to say that Italian food is photographed a certain way. Mexican food is photographed a certain way, and sometimes that can get tired and tacky and kind of cartoonish when you put a sombrero on the table when you're taking a photo of Mexican food, or the Italian flag or whatever. It's the same thing with anything native. Doesn't matter what's going on, first Native American in space. The photo on top of the article is going to be somebody in powwow regalia up in space in the stars. Or this native doctor found a cure for cancer. The photo is going to be somebody in powwow regalia in an oncology department or whatever. So it's kind of the same with photographing Native food. A lot of people put down the Indian blanket. They put some beads down or some feathers down. And it's not to say that other Native people do that too. That's what happened when I went to that fry bread truck with Padma. It was just a regular folding table out there on the street. But since the cameras were around, they brought out the Pendleton blanket, and and there was a feather around, but they decided to take that out last minute. And I was just like, oh my gosh, you can take out all of these different things and just photograph the food nicely and with a little bit more class without these contrasting contrasting designs, or just putting it in a pigeonhole. Pigeonholing the aesthetics of food. And I'm sure that goes with every other kind of food too. And
right.
Our artists and photographers out there who just want to show a beautiful plate, and maybe their aesthetic is a little bit different, and they like to use certain kind of colors, a certain kind of emotion when they're photographing. So it's really interesting to see. Looking at food photos is one of my favorite things ever. I wish I could just do that all the time and just study the evolution, I guess, the evolution of food photography. But in your world of wild food, and you have this whole book about wild food, what are some things that in that culture, in that scene, that you want to see changed?
In the wild food scene?
Out there in the wild.
Yeah. Well, a lot of what my book kind of asks is there wild nature left? Humans have impacted the planet so extensively. We've changed the climate. We move more sediment around than the earth does on its own. So by all of our digging and mountain building, we move more dirt around than rivers do, or landslides or things like that. So we've become this like incredible force of nature. But a lot of what my book talks about is similar stuff that you're talking about in terms of how we make sure we're not appropriating, how we make sure that we, understand the impact that our foraging and hunting is having on the local wild food populations and the indigenous communities that perhaps rely on that food. But Amara was put in the chat here about kind of eating with our eyes. And one of the things I love about wild food is that it's got this very disorderly aesthetic. So, unlike kind of molecular gastronomy where everything is very like small and put together, if you think about part of what makes wild food amazing is that it's not part of this industrial food system. And so when you get a mushroom from the mountains, it's not going to be perfect looking. It's going to have this irregularity to it. And that often reflects much more complex and interesting flavors as well. So you're not having the sort of watered down taste, but this really condensed, very interesting taste to it. But yeah, I mean, the aesthetics of eating are really interesting because some people might find that wild aesthetic to be off-putting, right? So, or scary in terms of mushrooms. People often are nervous about going out, which you probably should be because they can kill you. You don't know what you're doing. I think what's interesting about the direction that I would like to see the food system go is actually more of rewilding our agricultural system. So it's less about relying on wild sources and more about bringing in some of that ecological harmony into how we grow food, which obviously native cultures have done for a very long time. Some of the reason that they were within, it wasn't always a perfect harmony in terms of their relationship to Mother Earth, but they understood it as a relationship, right? So it wasn't about just extraction. It was a mutualism that was happening there. There's a lot of talk about regenerative agriculture and some really interesting ways that the white regenerative world has missed the kind of boat in terms of not acknowledging indigenous perspectives and knowledge around that. So, because I think if we just decide, okay, I remember when I first saw Dole bananas, organic bananas, and I was like, okay, I'm going to buy these organic bananas because I believe in organic food. But actually, is that really changing much if I'm still putting my money into this very large global corporate structure? Now it just says organic. Maybe they use slightly different pesticides, right? So I think reimagining the food system is going to require reimagining a lot of our cultural systems in the same way that addressing climate change is going to require that. And I'm not sure, with COVID, we've all seen that we can very quickly change and adapt to how we are doing things in an emergency. And yet a large portion of our country has decided not to follow some of those things. So, I don't know how, I do think that people respond better to hope and excitement. So it's really cool to hear that a lot of native chefs are pushing food and the beauty and the deliciousness of native food while also addressing the issues of food sovereignty and, bringing the resources that need to go to native communities. So I think it's kind of like a combo of the carrot and the stick. We can't keep doing what we're doing, but also how do we make local regenerative food exciting to people and also accessible. A lot of my book talks about how some of these foods that used to be poverty foods are now very expensive. And actually you brought up the Cherokee earlier. So one of the case studies I was looking at was ramps, which we don't get out here, but I was living on the East Coast and they're a wild onion, super delicious, very trendy, all over restaurants in New York. But access to them, part of the demand for them has really ruined the wild supply, and the Cherokee have been using them for thousands and thousands of years sustainably, and yet can't access a lot of their ancestral gathering grounds. So we have to really be careful when these kind of trends pop up, how we approach them and how we buy into them. So
Yeah, definitely. You're talking about Indigenous people having access. I mean, that is something that, the number one thing that prevents me from wanting to learn about wild foods. I mean, I live in Albuquerque. I live on the west side, but like, where am I going to go to like, harvest a cactus? Every year I watch the cactus like on the street just kind of give these beautiful fruits and then it dies and but I've always been told that you don't pick right by the road, which is where all the cactuses are. But so there's that. I mean, how can people like navigate that? Like, where is it okay for me in the city to learn about this? I mean, do I need like a mentor who can show me the secret spots? Or
Right. I mean, a lot of like with mushroom gatherers, there's always a sort of territorial issue. And actually this came up this year with the pinon nut harvest, which we only get, 5 to 7 years in New Mexico. The pinon nuts put forth their delicious buttery nuts. And there was a whole argument on that next door website about people trespassing on private property, other people saying, I'm okay with people coming onto my land to pick. It's so much a part of tradition in northern New Mexico. So it's definitely an issue that's going to keep coming up, is sort of how, and of course it goes back to like very old issues around private property. A lot of Native culture was much more communal. Property rights shifted with the season. So you didn't even have like a static boundary because you were following plants and animals depending on the food source seasonally. So how do we make sure that access is available to people, particularly in a state that has really, really rich people and really, really poor people, right? We have such huge disparity here in terms of access. So it's a challenging one, but yeah, I mean, it's always helpful to find a mentor. You probably, depending how busy the roadway is, you might be okay. You don't want to be picking it like alongside a major highway.
Yeah. And one more thing, how did you get into foraging?
Yeah. So I grew up in Tesuque on about 20 acres and just spent a lot of my childhood wandering around alone in the arroyos. And I think I definitely come from a foodie family. I'm Jewish and Italian, and both cultures have grandmothers who are like, eat, you're too skinny, like you need to eat more food. So it's definitely part of that history, which I think almost every culture has, sort of the mother, grandmother figure who's like, you need to eat more. And so there was always food involved. And then as a kid, we'd go up to the mountains and pick raspberries or pinon nuts. My mom had an amazing garden growing up, and we'd find rattlesnakes in the garden. So it always kind of had this wildness to it. And then I got into the food world, writing about it mostly from the environmental world. So actually trying to bring more people into the conversation about environmental conservation and sort of ecological imaginings. So how, food is something that we all love to talk about and connect with. So that was a way for me to talk about these other things. Like I have a friend who's like, I've never been camping, I don't like nature. And she totally loved my book and connected to it and got something out of it for that. So Amara says, are there rules about collecting? How much, where, limitations? So the kind of rule of thumb is take 10% and leave 90% behind for nature. But that depends how many other people are picking in the area, right? So if you're taking 10% and the next person taking 10%, it quickly gets depleted. What I tell people who are interested in foraging is go find the location that you're interested in and walk that land for a year and notice how the plants are changing over the course of the seasons. Notice how they're interacting with other plants. A year is sort of a minimum, but really it's about creating that relationship to the land and being aware of those cycles, because nature also, just like the aesthetics is very disorderly, the production is not very, 1 year you have an abundance of pinon nuts and then 5 years you have nothing. So being really aware of those cycles is really important, and the irregularity in it. I do think finding mentors is awesome. Someone to take you out and show you the way. But yeah, spend a lot of time just being in the place that you're interested in foraging and, communing with the plants. I think that's one way to do it. Hunting is a little different because it's much more regulated. So you have to get a permit. I went elk hunting with my dad this year, and it's a really beautiful and intense experience. And that's something that also helps, they had a friend with them this year who I think it was his second hunt. So just learning how to do it from someone else, which full circle kind of brings us back to where we started in the beginning about so much food culture and traditions being taught through the doing of the thing and through the storytelling, rather than, you can't really learn to hunt from a book. So I think it's important that we keep those traditions alive and let them morph, right? As we adapt to the environment that we're all living in. But yeah, any other thoughts? Last questions from the audience? Who's out there? We want to see you.
I want to thank you both for taking time out of your busy schedules to be here tonight with us. I feel like out of this conversation, we could have like 10 more programs, but yeah, I just want to thank you, and you can wrap up with last thoughts. I just wanted to share our appreciation on behalf of CCA.
Yeah, well, there's definitely a lot more to talk about. I would, when you're out there eating, when you're out there tasting around, just be conscious of the people behind the plate. There's whole cultures behind the plate. There's, definitely like a staff of, 5 or 500 that was used and labored for you to have your plate of food. And yeah, just be mindful about that. And, I know in the food world, we talk about, making connections through food and connecting with culture through food and having conversations, that are next level through food. And that is very true if you're open to it. I had an experience like that, about 10 years ago, and, really just like solidified my passion for food. Like I had this plate of food for the first time, and I was like, oh my God.
What was all hungry?
It was Afghan food. It was Afghan food. That's why I love it so much. And that's why I needed to learn a lot more about it. But, I had this beautiful spread of, all the foods. And it was just like the best thing I've ever had in my whole life. It's still the best thing I've ever had in my whole life. And I was like, how can I not know anything about the beauty of this culture and the beauty of Afghanistan across the world when this food here is so great? and so I made it a point to add the Middle East to all of the stuff I was interested in, and Middle Eastern flavors and history, and how yeah, there's so much to learn, so much more to learn. I wish I had more food experiences like that, but after COVID.
Definitely. Well, I just want to thank Amara and Andy so much for having this conversation. I think these kinds of conversations can be hard, no one wants to hear stay in your lane, but I think they're so vital to moving these things forward and moving towards equity and ecological, I don't even want to say harmony because we're so far from that, but something that's not completely ecologically destructive in how we feed ourselves on a daily basis. But I appreciate the audience for showing up on a Friday night, and I hope everyone stays cozy in these times. We're going to get through it. And, I feel like connecting to that food every time you eat is one way to really have gratitude for this moment, and gratitude for that sustenance in these really difficult times. So yeah, sending love out to everybody and appreciation. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a great night.